Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Alex. Thanks a lot for everybody who's been involved in organizing this amazing conference in a wonderful venue. And I've never been to Cardiff, so it's really, really lovely. So thank you everyone for joining. And today we're going to be talking about documentation. And just to cut through some of the introduction, because this slot is like a little bit shorter than what I'm used to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a few assumptions, and hopefully we can agree on that, or if not, we can talk about it later, because discussion is highly encouraged in a civil manner. We want to have more users and contributors to our projects, to our products. We want to increase adoption and increase the community. And we believe, or want to believe, we really want to believe that documentation can help. But maybe something is stopping us from improving our documentation, investing a little bit more. We're not quite sure what to do. And I do have a couple of notes here. We are not here to argue about whether or not documentation is important, and actually we're not here to argue about anything. You know, documentation is communication, and as communicators, let's try to remember how to do that. And like Alex said, I will not be taking questions. This is actually a write the docs. In our conferences, we don't leave time for questions because we find that we get more comments disguised as questions. And we prefer to encourage people to actually come up. So I will be here either in talks or loitering somewhere downstairs throughout the whole conference. I'm also going to be running a documentation help desk on Monday. So we can, I need to reset my timer. So you can come up and talk to me. You can also tweet, Slack, email, and just let's have a talk, and just you can write your questions down or whatever it is that you want to do. Okay, what happened? So who is that docs lady? That's me. That's Mikey Ariel. I'm originally from Israel, but I'm based in Prague. I work for Red Hat as a technical writer, and currently I'm documenting OpenStack platform, which is the product that Red Hat makes out of the upstream OpenStack. I spent the last year working on OpenShift, Minishift. It's a cloud infrastructure. It's a PaaS, a little bit all-in-one VMs to deploy it, and it's actually a really nice little upstream project. I'll be giving some examples from that. I used to work on JBoss, and I'm a recovering Scrum Master. In my spare time, beyond work, I'm also Write the Docs community manager, and we have a team. Right now we're organizing a couple of big conferences, well, relatively not as big as this, but we have 2 conferences happening every year, one in Portland and one in Prague, where I live. I've also been organizing Django Girls workshops, not so much these days because work-life balance and sleep is important. I come to conferences such as this one, and I talk about documentation, and I run documentation sprints, and I do coaching for open source projects, or as they call it, free consulting, but you know, it's community, so. And I also contributed to Fedora documentation, NixOS, and wherever people may need documentation assistance, you know, they can come and talk to me. So what's on the menu today? What I'm going to talk about? There's going to be 3 parts to this talk. The first part is about content strategy, which basically means if you plan a little bit ahead of time, you can save a lot of time, effort, aggravation later. And it's not just for documentation, but you know, historically, documentation's kind of been an aftermath, but it's no longer the case, thankfully and hopefully. And the second thing I'm going to talk about is DevOps, which is basically all the framework and the tooling. So we'll geek out about tooling today, so that'll be nice. And the third thing is about the community spirit and all the human side of documentation and what's been going on. Somebody took my water. Can I have another water? Thank you. Thank you, Daniela, for organizing everything. Give him a round of applause. He's been great. He spoke at our conferences as well. All right, so I would like to invite you to join the Documentarian Club. Now, what is the Documentarian Club? I hear you ask silently. This text is taken from the Write the Docs website. And a documentarian is someone who cares about documentation and communication in the software industry, regardless of job title. Right? So everybody's like, oh, documentation, it's this thing that happens to technical writers. Not really. So I'm assuming that this is a primarily development-focused conference. Raise your hand if you're a developer. All right. Raise your hand if you also do DevOps. Raise your hand if you do some design, UX. All right. So we have people who are like, if you're writers. All right. More than I thought. Excellent. You know, support. Exactly. So we have a lot of cross roles and multiple roles, and we can all care about content, about documentation, about communication in our own way, right? So it's not just for tech writers anymore. Everybody can care about this. So, first thing I want to talk about is content strategy, which is asking the right questions in advance and save some time later. Originally, content strategy was a marketing term. It was from content marketing and web content, or as some engineers I know would say, thank you, something that happens to other people. But if you're running an open source project, you got to do some marketing. You know, there's so many things out there. There's so many projects, so many tools. You know, how can you be heard above the noise? So, and how can you make sure to invest your time effectively without having to, you know, people think that you have to document all the things. We don't have to document all the things anymore. We just have to document the things that matter. And how do you determine what's important, right? So, we're talking about need to know docs, okay? So need to know docs means, do you really need to know this? And you don't need to know everything, right? This is something that we're dealing with a lot more on the enterprise side of documentation, because it used to be that, you know, we get a team of tech writers and they're documenting every single thing about our software. But who really reads this? How much of our documentation is actually consumed? How much of our documentation is useful? All right, so I want to take a look at the trusty old 5W questions. All right, so the first one is who? Who is my reader? Who are my readers? Who are my users? Right, so you can break this down in a few ways. Right, you can have developers, sysadmins, end users. You can do it by role. You can do it by level, like beginner-friendly documentation, more advanced documentation, or people who are going into more deep dive documentation. You can also divide it by region, because different regions have some maybe cultural differences. People consume information in different ways. Right, so who are you? And once you figure that out, then you want to figure out what is it that they need and what are they likely to be interested in, right? So for example, you can have architecture diagrams, you can have troubleshooting information, you can have, like, let's say deployment. Sorry, I'm getting buzzed. So what do people need to know? Like, really, what information do you need to know? And in order to help you with that, what you want to do is figure out also when they need to know this. So for example, if I have an open source project, I have a README file, right? The README file is your neighborhood-friendly README file. What information do I need to give my readers exactly then? And how much do I want to provide to them? You don't want to clutter your README. I'm going to talk about this later. I'll give you some examples, plenty of screenshots. And, you know, how much information do you need to present in an error message, right? And do you want to direct your users to reading more information later? And another example is, let's say, reference guides. You know, you want to, for example, this when question. So it's like, by the time that your users get to something like a reference guide, then they're likely to be a little bit frustrated with not being able to figure out how a certain command works or what to do, right? So you want to construct your documentation to give users just the information they need at any given time. And then the next question is, of course, where, right? So where do readers consume this information? So do I want to invest in creating a man page? Do I want to actually generate a static doc site? Is the README in GitHub enough? Do I need to actually publish something directly from the code? Like, because if you do code comments, you know, is it enough to have the code comments live in the code? Or do I actually want to sort of auto-doc something, and publish it somewhere so that users can get to it from a different place? And error messages are a legitimate form of documentation, so don't forget that. They always seem to be left behind somewhere. And the last question is why? Why do I need to know this? How does this help me? This is the WIFM test, the what's in it for me. As a user, I come to your software and I say, all right, I'm stuck, I want to learn how to solve a problem. How do I do this? And this is something that, the whole state of mind around documentation is not just like, hey, my software can do all these amazing things. Yes, but how is your software going to help me solve my problem as a user? And this is something that, it's also like something that sometimes reveals an underlying problem. So for example, if you're like, oh, I want to document a bunch of troubleshooting steps, then around a certain component, maybe you want to look at that component and see how it actually works, and maybe you want to go back and fix some things. We don't want to just document bugs, right? So this is the big one, so who needs to know my content? What do they need to know? When do they need to know this? Where are they going to find out? And why do they even care? It doesn't usually take that long to ask these questions. Depending on the size of your project or whatever, it can just really be like a little light bulb and help you save a lot of times later. So examples of documentation things that I like. So the first one is GNOME Help. This is when you go to their website. For example, if I use Fedora, which I do, and I click, and I open the help, I just get the desktop help because I need the information where it's relevant, right? So, but if I go to the websites, the first thing, wait, I'm having a new laser pointer. Does it work? So GNOME asks me, who are you? Are you a user, administrator, developer? And depending on, if I'm a user, I get mostly the desktop help, and then they have a whole bunch of new tools now, because nothing is just a desktop anymore. And if I'm an administrator, then I get only the content that I need, right? So this is, and a developer as well. And these are, if you want to browse to documentation, then they have a really, really nice role division. Okay, so that's in their static site. Another example that I always love to give is the Arch Linux Wiki, and the Arch Linux is probably the geekiest Linux distribution I've heard of. And they have a great wiki, and everybody talks so many great things about it, but you know why? Because it has a wonderful search capability, because if you look at, the screen is pretty cluttered, it's not really browsable, but nobody cares because you can search. And most people will arrive at this website when they've already tried everything, because Arch users are just, I want to make sure I do this myself most of the time, and, by the time that they look for help, they've tried everything else. So searching in a wiki is usually really good, so they've prioritized that, searchability over browsability. So the other thing, I was talking about Minishift, which is the product that I was working on. So it was a brand new tool, well, brand new, it was a fork of Minikube from Kubernetes, and we kind of inherited their very slim doc set, which was I think it was 4 files. And we've kind of expanded it when we adapted it to work on, to deploy a containerized OpenShift instance instead of Kubernetes. So we had, everything is working on GitHub, and these are all projects, and then Red Hat downstreams that over to their products. And then this is what we ended up having for the README. And I'm sorry that it's a little bit small, but I will post the slides so you can also see it. And you can also go and see the README yourself. And what is the best thing about this README is that it's short, right? It's short, it's got, a few subheadings, a few sentences in each, some links, it's a portal, right? So what you really want is to have, if somebody's going into your house and they're going into the foyer, they don't want to see all of your stuff cluttered, right? They want to be able to get, acclimated and familiarized and then go to where it is that they need to go in your house. So it's the same thing. And if the README is probably the most useful piece of documentation that you can have. I mean, they talk about README-driven development, which also helps you kind of think in advance, how are you going to explain to people how to use your software? So, but I mean, even if you don't go as far to that extreme, then just investing in your README is going to save you a lot of time later, because it's the first thing that people will see. And another example of where and when do we want to give information is we had this thing in Minishift where we had to give a warning banner in the terminal in case the users of our VM tried to install packages with yum on the root file system, and the root file system on the VM is tiny, on purpose, because users are not supposed to do that. But of course, people will never do what they want them to do, and they will always try to do things they're not supposed to do. So we need to give them some kind of warning to say, like, if you're going to install these packages, you're going to fill the root file system on this VM. But we can't, so we have like more information that we needed to give than there was space, right? So what we ended up doing is we split it up. So the actual error message has just 2 sentences. The first sentence, we kind of tried to compress. Why is it, like, you know, installing additional packages on the root file system might exceed the allocated overlay size, which is the problem. And our users are developers, so they're supposed to, we made an assumption that they're supposed to understand what overlay size is, and lock the Minishift VM. So it's like, you're gonna be in trouble. And proceed with the installation at your own risk, which is something that Linux users really, they know this, okay? At your own risk is something that you can use. Even though it might be a little bit more casual. And we also gave them a link to our troubleshooting guide in case they don't believe us, right? They're like, no, I don't believe you that this is gonna happen. I wanna know more. Please explain more. And there it is. Okay, so we have a static site where we publish the Minishift documentation, and here we gave all of the nice little prosy thing, the story of what happens with the root file system, and also if you want to, we gave them a recommendation, if you want to install packages, we have shared storage, you know, that you can set up in a host folder. So we gave them an out, we gave them an alternative, but we couldn't put all this information in the error message, right? So for people who really wanted to know more, we gave them a whole troubleshooting section. Okay, so those were a few examples. There are plenty more, and there are plenty more of examples of not done right, but I kind of wanted to keep the talk more positive, you know, give a little bit of inspiration. So now let's geek out about tools a little bit, okay? Tools and workflow. And content strategy comes from, I spoiled myself. Content strategy comes from marketing, DevOps comes from development world, and you know, if the tech writer is looking at all the fun that the developers are having with continuous integration and all sorts of tooling, then we say, well, we can't have that. And this is the secret ingredient, which I totally ruined by getting this slide too early, is integration, right? So we integrate. We cannot try to even beat the developers in their own game. There's no point. We're all working on this together, right? So developers have already solved so many of these problems for code, and there are so many inspiration points that we can take, and things have really come along. Since I started working as a tech writer almost 10 years ago, we were working in FrameMaker and publishing PDFs and printing books. And I don't think I've had to look at a PDF for the last 3 years maybe, which PDFs are still a thing for some things, mostly for hardware if you need to actually print things. But, and we do still publish them, for example, on the Red Hat customer portal. We do have PDFs, but they're not the primary use case. So we work in software, people are used to working in front of their computer, they're not used to reading books anymore. They're not even used to reading online guides anymore, but I'll talk about that in a second. So there are many ways that we can integrate the documentation into the development workflow, and one of them is the tooling. And for example, if we treat docs as code, so this is a screenshot of our, I'm going to use Minishift again because it's my baby and I've spent the last year building it. And so we have a folder called docs, right there in the root. We also have contributing guidelines, and we have the README there. And we have modular source content. Okay, so in a similar way that you don't want to have one file with 10,000 lines of code or even 5,000, or I don't even know how many lines of code is considered too many for one file. I don't know. Okay, let's say arbitrarily 200, and if you have a problem with that, talk to Harry. So the kind of golden rule or golden guideline, because things are a little bit more flexible in documentation, is that if I have to scroll, for example, more than once or twice in a topic, it's usually too long. Then it's usually better to break it, or if I have, let's say, more than 3 or 4 maximum subheadings in a topic, then I try to break it down into separate files. So here you have, I highlighted the breadcrumbs, so we have the root repository, we have docs folder source, and the getting started category. Right, so that will translate into, getting started will translate into an entry in the table of content on the sidebar of our static doc site. And inside you have the different topics. And each of these topics we try to keep relatively short. And it does not just for the reading part that matters, it's also for our own content management. Right, so if you have smaller file sizes, that are organized hierarchically, and most of the documentation publication tools can handle nested folders and include directives. So if we have that, if we need to change something, so for example, if this section gets too big, maybe not the getting started section because that shouldn't get too big, then if we need to move one of these topics around, it's much easier than to try and, if you have one file with a lot of text in it, to try and move things around. It's just easier, it's more flexible, and you also have a better way of monitoring things. Every one of these files will have, they translate to URLs, and you can move them around, nested, and everything is just really nice. To be able to do that. And the other thing that we integrate into is the issue tracking. And if you are working with GitHub, you will be familiar with these. And the labels, which is, as far as I understand, currently the best way to handle these. I have different issue trackers and different source control systems will have different things, like Jira has a much more flexible and robust mechanism to tag issues and categorize them and move them around. But GitHub is the default for most open source project, GitHub, GitLab. So we just added a documentation component. And what we do is we tag different issues with a documentation component. So when would we tag issues with a documentation component? So either the actual issue is documentation, or if we have a different issue down here, is let's say Minishift update fails on trying to create a directory. This is a developer issue that will require documentation. So additional documentation beyond what the developers need to do. So continuous publication. This is something that we are integrating as well into the system. Same as you do continuous deployment, we can do that now too. Depending on whatever your format is, your markup language, ASCII doc, restructured text, Markdown. There are tools nowadays that you can just, merge your PR and then get your documentation published. We have continuous builds, continuous deployment. This is from Read the Docs. We also have live preview staging, which we just added to write the docs to our website, which is really nice. So every time we submit a PR, this Netify thing is and it works. And testing automation, still hard, because documentation doesn't neatly compile into binaries. So unit testing and things like that is a little bit harder. Of course, there's the trusty Hemingway app, which will tell you if your sentences are too convoluted, or if you're using ginormous words, or real words. And there's Emender, which is a test automation framework where you can basically feed your style guide to it. And there are more efforts being done on this. I would love to hear if anybody's doing anything around unit testing, integration testing, and because you can do basic things like link checks and XML validation and things like that, but we're trying to go beyond that, and hopefully we can. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the community spirit. And that basically means docs or it didn't happen, all right? If you make your docs a requirement, like these projects do, then it's a good start, you know? You gotta get that mindset into people, you know? And also you wanna do, it helps to have contribution guidelines, how to contribute to the documentation. Documentation can be a really great way for new contributors to onboard to your project. So if you do this in a friendly way, people will want to contribute to your documentation. Okay, you can give templates. Sorry, this is a README template from Write the Docs. And you can join the growing documentarian community. We have Write the Docs, which I'm organizing the Prague conference and also supporting the Portland conference. We have meetups, we have a Slack space. There's Open Help, which is more sprint focused, organized by a good buddy of mine in Cincinnati. And they do more of sprints and on conferences. We also, I try, and a few of us do try as well, to run doc sprints and hackfests. And I will be there tonight, I guess in the Code Dojo. I'm going to be hovering around if anybody needs any help, if you need to document the things that you're working on. And also during the sprints, and also around the conference. So just find me, okay? And that's it for me. Welcome to the Documentarian Club. It's good to have you. Thank you.